I am Joel McLeod.
I'm Roland Tanner.
And welcome to the 905er. A little while ago, a tweet caught my attention. It was from the Halton Police Twitter account, and it said, "We are in the midst of a drug poisoning emergency. In the last 86 days, our officers have responded to 103 suspected overdoses, and the community has lost 13 loved ones to substance use or misuse so far this year. These are not statistics, these are lives." This caught our attention. While we have been focused on the pandemic for the last few years, there has also been an epidemic of opioid overdoses happening in our own backyard. We wanted to get some insight into this other public health crisis that's happening here in the 905. So we thought we'd reach out to the man in charge of the organization that is trying to raise the alert of the public. Chief Steve Tanner was born in Oakville and has had a long career in policing. Starting in 1982, he started working for the Halton PD, and he has since gone on to serve as Deputy Chief of Guelph, Belleville, later the Chief of Police for Belleville, and later the Chief of Police for Kingston. In January 2012, he was appointed by the Governor General of Canada as an Officer of the Order of Merit of the Police Services. As well, that year he became Chief of Police for Halton and has remained there ever since. Today we invited on Chief Tanner to join us and discuss the opioid crisis and what steps the Halton Police are taking to address it, and what more can be done publicly to ensure the safety of all people in the 905. Thank you and enjoy.
Well, welcome, Chief Steve Tanner of Halton Regional Police to the 905 podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation and my privilege to be here.
So to start off, can you just give us an idea of how the opioid epidemic is affecting our region in Halton and the 905?
Yeah, this epidemic's been going on for a while now, and it's probably been overshadowed media-wise by COVID-19 for a whole number of different reasons. But it's an ongoing epidemic. It's at critical levels here in Halton as well as across the GTA and across the country. I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of overdoses, and I'll give you an example. In the last 3 months, over the first 3 months of 2022, we had 111 overdoses and 14 deaths. And those are just the incidents that the Halton Regional Police responded to. So there may be others that the paramedics dealt with or hospitals dealt with. So those are just Halton Police numbers. So maybe it's twice that, or there's other overdoses that, aren't brought to the attention of the police, and people survive, thankfully, in those instances. But if you go back over the past 27 months, it's over 700 overdoses just in Halton region that the police have responded to, and 104 deaths that we know of, and probably more because sometimes there's some toxicology issues with the Center of Forensic Science and being able to prove that it was an opioid death. So the numbers are really astronomical when you think about that level of impact just in the Halton region.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you're talking just Halton police numbers responding to this, and I just kind of want to give our listeners a sense of when a Halton police officer is called in to respond to the situation. What can you kind of give us I want to put us in the footprints of a Halton police officer. Like, what are they thinking when they're responding to this? Because I'm suspecting that what a Halton police officer is preparing in their mind when they're responding to the call and what the average public has in their mind are going to be two very different things. And I just want to throw that open to you.
Yeah, and there's probably a range, Joel, because calls come in different ways. Sometimes it comes in from a family member or a friend. A friend may know that the person was using drugs, so it might come in as a potential overdose. Other times it might come in as an unconscious person, unknown problems. Someone appears to be unconscious and not breathing. So we took the extra step now years ago, and we were one of the first police services in Ontario to give naloxone to all of our frontline members. There was a bit of a debate about that at the time because medical aid is not the first priority for police officers always. We have our paramedics, but often the police, because we're out in the community 24 hours a day, often we're the first ones that get to these types of calls. So I think it was a very prudent decision on behalf of the service to give all of our members naloxone. So sometimes they have a good idea that it may be an overdose when they're responding to the calls, and sometimes it's totally unknown, and they have to gauge sort of the symptoms that the person is exhibiting at the time and choose to administer naloxone or not. The good thing about naloxone is it's not harmful. So if there's an unconscious person who has not overdosed on opioids or fentanyl, it's not harmful to give them naloxone. That's a blessing for sure.
When you're responding, I guess I want to give our listeners a kind of a sense of, because I'm gonna suspect that some are thinking these are junkies. They're everybody has that stereotypical view in their head of a drug user, especially when you get to the level of overdose. And I know you can't give specifics, but maybe a general sense of who are the people that the police officers are responding to. Who when you're getting a call in, are they expecting junkies? Are they expecting what, or is it just a complete shock here to you?
Yeah, really it can be anybody. We've had professional individuals in their 40s, 50s, 60s that have overdosed. So it's not the stereotype is probably what we see on the streets of Vancouver with heroin, where people are, lined up down alleyways and they're injecting heroin into their veins directly and IV drug use. So it really runs the gambit of addictions and mental health issues, and often mental health ties in with addictions. And we also have a number of overdoses, and it would be surprising probably to the public sometimes, not to us. We have a number of overdoses that are inside the Maplehurst Correctional Facility. So inmates who are still able to obtain fentanyl and different drugs while they're in prison. There's a variety of ways that's possible. But we have a number of overdoses and even deaths of inmates in the correctional facility in Milton. So it's all ages, it's professionals, it's young people experimenting. Sometimes it certainly is people that are taking drugs and they might think it is something different and they don't know that it's fentanyl. So the thing with fentanyl, the way that we had it described to us early on, when you buy a pharmaceutical drug, every tablet is exactly the same because they are so professionally made and mixed, and that there's 50 milligrams in an aspirin. With fentanyl, it's basically like a grain, the smallest grain of sand, and they're not mixed well. So if you get a tablet that has 2 grains of sand in it instead of 1, that's probably fatal. And you don't know where the stuff is coming from. You don't know where it's manufactured, whether it's a lab in Mexico or China or made here in Canada. So that's the danger with this drug, is it's so volatile and so strong, and people don't have any idea what they're actually ingesting.
Obviously, are a percentage of these opioid deaths a result of intentional actions by people, or is it more a case of recreational drug use going wrong?
Yeah, there's certainly, sadly, there are far too many suicides and attempt suicides. Sometimes those are by consuming different drugs. I'm not so sure that people intentionally commit suicide as often with fentanyl if they're that type of drug user. But it's possible. The other thing that happens, though, which is even more scary, Roland, is we know of individuals who purposely take too much fentanyl just so they do overdose and technically die, knowing that there's somebody there with them to give them naloxone and bring them back. It's a bizarre behavior, which many people will never understand. But it's sort of described by some people and some people in the medical field of that, optimal feeling of high, I guess. And so there are people who intentionally overdose on fentanyl thinking that someone is going to be there to bring them back. If that's successful, they survive and great, I suppose. But what if that person doesn't administer naloxone timely enough, or they're also taking drugs? And so there's so many things that can go wrong. And as I said, this drug is so powerful and so unpredictable, and people don't know what the quantity is. That's the risk. And when you see some of the messaging that our corporate communications people put out in social media, that often is when we've had 3 or 4 overdoses in a very short period of time, maybe in one part of one of our cities. So it's we're trying to send the signal that there might be some really extra bad stuff out there, and be careful. But not everyone's watching our Twitter feed, so we can't reach everyone and tell them that this is dangerous, unfortunately.
Obviously, as police, your primary role is law enforcement. So when you're in these kinds of situations where someone has overdosed on an illegal drug, how do you proceed in those kind of situations? Is it a matter of making sure the person gets to hospital but then also prosecuting them, or what's the actual procedure in cases like that?
Yeah, there's something, and it was a good thing that the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, we kind of lobbied for and then supported government on something that's called the Good Samaritan Act. So I can tell your listeners that we have never laid a charge against somebody when we've been called for an overdose type of situation for what I would call simple possession. So sometimes when you get into differentiating between possession of a drug, no matter what it is, and trafficking or possession for the purpose of trafficking is obviously larger quantities. So the point of this act is when we're called to a scene of an overdose or a death, and there's other people there and there are drugs present, fairly small quantities, more that personal use sort of quantities, then we do not lay charges to bring people before the criminal courts or the drug courts for possession. If there was a huge amount of drugs there, then that would be different, and there would probably be trafficking or possession for the purpose of trafficking charges. But that's not what we're there for. We're there really as a human service, first responders, to save people. And we administered naloxone in many of those, 111 overdoses so far this year, and end up our officers probably saving those people's lives. And some of them come back and thank us. It's rare, but there is, notes and calls of thanks for people that have been saved. And I think that message has to get out from some of those people that, I was lucky enough that the police or the EMS got here in time. Don't do this to yourselves.
What you're describing seems to me a bit like a Band-Aid solution to a much larger problem that is of addiction and mental health in our communities. And again, a lot of this, I think, comes down to, it falls on the shoulders of police services, not just in Halton, but I think across the country, that, what things go bad, call the police, regardless of the situation. And I think, you might have a unique insight for this next question, but what would you like to see change, maybe in terms of policy from provincial or federal governments towards this epidemic in our country?
Yeah, I was thinking about that a little bit just the hour before we got together here this morning, Joel. And it's, there is talk of, as we all know, they legalized marijuana. There's a great debate around that. I think it was helpful in some ways. Personally, I always thought it should have been decriminalized, not necessarily legalized. There's a whole tax component to that, quite frankly, more than public health and welfare. I'm not opposed to marijuana, and I think there are some good reasons for it to be more lawful than it was before. There's no reason to have a 15, 16-year-old kid with a criminal record because he had 2 joints of marijuana. That's that happened in the 1980s and 90s when I started policing. But there is talk of, the potential to legalize all drugs. Some countries have done that. It does not take, one thing for readers to recognize, it does not take organized crime out of those drugs. The Hells Angels, the traditional organized crime mafia groups still make millions of dollars from marijuana. They will always make money from drugs like fentanyl and heroin and cocaine as well. The Colombian and Mexican cartels are alive and well. But there's a downside, I think, to legalizing all drugs as well, because there is a deterrent. At least there is some deterrent, not for everyone. I mean, if you're truly addicted, the fear of being caught is not a deterrent. But I think for a certain percentage of people in our society, or our region, or elsewhere, I think there's a certain amount of deterrent if it is illegal that they might not try it. If you legalize things like fentanyl and heroin and cocaine, it sort of takes some of that deterrent away. And I sort of have this fear that more people will experiment with it. And then there's going to be more overdoses and more deaths. So it's kind of a catch-22. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's no reason to take a truly addicted person or a person suffering from various mental illnesses and addiction into a criminal court because they had a small amount of any drug.
Your answer there opened the door in my head to a number of other questions. And I agree, I'm not here to advocate for legalization of drugs because I'll be honest, that's way outside my purview. I'm not educated enough on that to have one opinion one way or the other. But what I did want to touch upon was you had mentioned things like, the Hells Angels, Mexican cartels, which I think everyone listening, and you included, say those are the real bad guys. Those are the guys that our police services should be targeting to dismantle their organizations and their networks in the country. Yep. Yet I find time and time again, Halton Police as well as other police services we're hearing more about you guys going into homes or places of business because of these overdoses. And it's this, it just seems like we're taking our eye off the ball. Like your service to the social good isn't to go and treat somebody suffering from addiction. Your goal really should be going into dismantle Hells Angels organized crime efforts in our communities. That I think that's the real, that should be where our efforts in terms of really combating crime should be. And I'm just, can you maybe comment on just that, how can we shift our focus away from treating the individual who has an addiction to really going after, honestly, the bad guys in our country?
Yeah, it's always a balance for us, right? It's there are people in throughout Halton who think the major issue is traffic and bad driving, and that's true too. And so we need to have Highway Traffic Act enforcement. And while our frontline officers, normally our uniform officers, may be responding to these overdoses, we also have special units and investigative units and drugs and human trafficking specialists who are working on that full time. So interestingly enough, I mean, between 2020 and 2021, those 24 months, our investigations and our officers took over 15 kilograms of fentanyl out of the hands of criminals, drug dealers, and sometimes users. And there's huge amounts. In 2021 alone, there was over 50 kilograms of cocaine seized here in Halton. Back in 1990, 91, when I was in Halton the first time in the sort of drug intelligence area, we seized 1 kilogram of cocaine. That was the largest amount we had actually seen in Halton at that time. Now we're talking about 50 kilograms in 1 year. And I think it's interesting because at least the courts have started to realize the dangers of fentanyl. And I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. We've had in 2020 and 2021, we had 2 individuals who were trafficking in fentanyl who were sentenced to 15 and 13 years in jail. So it's not, 2 less a day. It's these people have trafficked large quantities of the most dangerous drug we know of, and people are dying. And so the courts are giving good sentences in those cases. So those are major investigations, sometimes joint forces between Halton and other neighboring police services, and also large forfeitures of money and property. In that one case, the individual was sentenced to 13 years and also forfeited $720,000 in cash and other property. So those are the sorts of people that we are also targeting. It's just different people that are doing that work.
And I take it these opioids are overwhelmingly manufactured abroad and then imported into Canada. Is that right?
Yeah, it's interesting with some drugs, they can't be manufactured here. I have a friend that was with the Canadian Border Security Agency, and they often reminded us when you are seizing cocaine, at some point it came across our border. So we need to, for cocaine and heroin mainly, we need to think about our borders and how it's getting in here. But fentanyl is manufactured. That's why it's a synthetic opioid. So it could be manufactured here by organized crime people, or it can be manufactured. It started out largely from China and then some from Mexico. And there were issues because small quantities could come in the mail, and Canada Post cannot look at every, package that's less than 10 grams or something. I can't remember the amounts, but you could, trickle stuff in. People can order it on the dark web over the internet and have it delivered in different ways. So the thing with fentanyl, it can be manufactured anywhere now, here or abroad and brought here. So it's definitely an epidemic.
And do you think that some of the responsibility for this crisis lies with originally with the pharmaceutical companies that developed some of these very strong synthetic opioids, and encouraged the medical community to sort of make use of them, and in that way kind of created almost like a gateway drug situation to people becoming addicted and then moving on potentially to even harder narcotics?
No, absolutely. I mean, the main example of that is OxyContin. So when oxys were being prescribed to so many people for pain and different things, several years ago now, the original oxy, now there's a neo-oxy, which is supposed to be less addictive, and you can't grind it down and use it in the same way as the original OxyContin. But so many people had their lives ruined by addictions to oxy and then other pharmaceutical drugs that they spun off to, and then those are available illegally on the streets too. There was I'm trying to think of there was a time in Northern Ontario where one OxyContin tablet was being sold for $60. I think it was, and people would cut it into quarters and sell it for $20 a quarter. If they could sell 3, they'd get their quarter free. But $60 a pill, if you could get it into, different communities where addictions were high or the demand was high, and obviously the money was there somehow. So it's again, it's organized crime, and I was thinking too when Joel was asking about Hells Angels and mafia and different things. One of the big players now are the street gangs, and Toronto street gangs. When you read about all the violence and the shootouts and people being gangs murdering one another, it's largely over the drug trade and over like turf wars, sort of like we used to think of the Bloods and the Crips having in LA. That's what's happening here. They're also into human trafficking and anything that can make money. So they're very organized groups, very much organized crime as well. And so there needs to be a lot of emphasis put on them.
Is there ultimately a solution to this problem? Is there something that we can do that will bring this crisis permanently to an end? In the past, certainly the case has been made for decriminalization and legalization, that that would perhaps be more effective by taking the money out of the equation. But is there an end point to this?
Yeah, it's sort of the product of supply and demand economics, and organized crime morphs into wherever they can make money. And as long as they can make money off of drugs, they will sell drugs, and they won't care if people overdose or die, because there'll be someone else ready to consume that and purchase it. So I think it's got to be a multifaceted thing where we try to deal with the addiction issues, hopefully more effectively through different service agencies and CMHA on the mental health side. Homelessness probably plays into this, especially in some of the larger cities. That's a bit of a stereotype. We don't have as much homelessness here in Halton, but we do have it, but not to the extent of Toronto or downtown Hamilton. So there are often mental health issues, coinciding with homelessness and then playing into addictions. But we also have to target the major players, and we need to seize as much of these drugs as we can that that 15 kilograms of fentanyl could have killed thousands of people if it got into the wrong hands at the wrong time. So unfortunately, there's another 15 or 30 or 50 kilograms that we haven't got, and resources are torn between all the different things that police services do. I sort of think hypothetically in the long run, as the RCMP, reimagine their role in policing across Canada, I'd like to see them involved in a lot of the national issues such as drugs and terrorism, which they do a lot of work, but I think there could be a refocusing if there wasn't. They're sort of split sometimes in other provinces doing municipal policing and a whole bunch of other things. And I think maybe we could refocus some of our national resources on major crimes.
Well, I was just going to say we're coming up on a half hour, and usually that's our cue to shut up. But I wanted to give you, Chief Tanner, kind of like the last word here, because somebody might be listening to this podcast and they might know somebody who is using drugs, and they might be concerned for that loved one, and they might be wondering how do we prevent them from having to call the Halton PD or paramedics for a bad day. And maybe I'm going to leave the mic to you, and they might be listening. They might be saying, "Hey, what can I do to help my friend, my wife, my husband, whomever?"
Yeah, I think it's the overdose and the deaths from overdoses similar to suicides. Everyone looks back after it happens and says, "What did I miss, and what could I have done differently?" So I would urge anyone who thinks that they have a friend or a loved one or anyone that they think is into dangerous sorts of drugs, maybe fentanyl, maybe not, any reach out might help to reach that person. I think most of us, I think it's human nature, I guess, and certainly in the drug culture, everyone thinks they are immune to these things happening. That might have happened to all those other people. It's not going to happen to me. Most of those people thought that same thing, and then it's too late and you can't go back. So we do urge people, if they are needing to use drugs, don't do it alone. Naloxone is free at pharmacies for people to pick up or for families to pick up. If you think someone in your family or a friend is using drugs, you can have naloxone there. It may save some. And that's sort of, ironically, it's similar to learning CPR in this drug world. So, but I would say anybody could reach out and try to warn people. Maybe that one more warning will be the warning that helps someone reach out for addiction counseling and for mental health counseling if it's necessary. So do all you can to stop people from using drugs. Try to take some precautions if you are using them. And there's no way to know where this stuff is coming from. So you can't trust your drug dealers. You can't trust the people that are manufacturing this stuff. And the only way you can actually be safe is not to touch it. If you are going to touch it, you got to take some precautions. You
mentioned something, and I'm going to lie to everyone. That was not the last question. This is the last question. Safe injection sites. What's your opinion on them for Halton?
Yeah, they're actually, they're not always safe. They're safer. They make people nervous because nobody wants it in their neighborhood. We went through the same thing. I was a chief in Belleville for 6 or 7 years and Kingston for 4 years. Nobody wanted the methadone clinic in downtown Belleville. You've got to be careful where you put some of those things. So there are pros and cons to them, but they are safer. And I certainly agree with that. It's got potential, but a lot of these people are not going to go there. So it's not like if you're using drugs and there's a safer injection site that you're going to go there every day. So it does have some benefits, but it's not the answer to everything.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chief Steve Tanner, for taking the time on your very busy schedule for coming on and just sharing us and enlightening us a lot, because you opened my mind to a few things I didn't know about this issue in our backyards, unfortunately. So thank you very much, Steve, for taking the time to come on the 905er.
No, you're very welcome. Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Joel. It's anytime, let me know, and I'm all yours.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns, or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.